before. So I'm going to talk to you about now the Tuskegee Syphilis experiment, which we talked a little bit about. There's a paragraph about it in the book. There's a bit more detail here. Called experiment. There wasn't an experiment because we don't, first of all, use that word anymore. And if it was, we would call it a trial. So it had some parts of a trial. If you say that they were being given arsenic and bismuth as a treatment that used to exist back then, probably significantly added to the morbidity and mortality of the African American men who were recruited for that study. It was a study, but it really didn't have any design to it either. It was just a kind of a curiosity to see the natural progression of the untreated disease. This is called, in clinical practice, this is called
Natural history.
no, the natural history. Natural history of a disease. The natural history of a disease is defined as what the disease, the steps it goes through, and what it does to the person with disease with no treatment. What's the natural history of the disease? What does it do? Relapses is an acute disease that comes and then gets better, or remits and relapses, or is it a disease that's very aggressive and will kill you very quickly? That's the natural history. So they were trying to find out the natural history of syphilis. But not much was known, as I said before. So they recruited these chaps and watched them. And the idea was they were being disinformed, as we said by definition before, that this was treatment, and this was the best treatment available, and so on. 399 impoverished. Right there you know they're vulnerable. Okay? Impoverished or poor, already vulnerable. This should make the connection. African American sharecroppers with syphilis, research related to the natural progression of the untreated disease. That's what we said. Natural history. They want to find out that. In the hopes of justifying treatment program for blacks. 40-year study controversial for reasons related to ethical standards. The researchers failed to treat patients appropriately after penicillin had been discovered and was available in the 1940s. This study started in 1932, so 10 years later, certainly 15 years into the study, there was an antibiotic for treating this, but it was allowed to go on for 40 years. A revelation of study failures that was revealed after it led to major changes in US law. We just saw an example of that, and Nito gave the presentation on the Belmont report. It was as a consequence largely because of the Tuskegee study and the publication of that study that became widely available, that Clinton took it upon himself to finish. President Clinton took it upon himself to terminate that study in 1974.
Excuse me. Is there any religious reason to continue this study? Because I read that scientists believe that they are deserved to be contaminated with syphilis.
The scientists believe that they are what?
They are deserved.
They are designed. They are chosen. They are selected.
No, they are deserved.
They
are
The scientists or the who deserves?
Actually, there are people who have a free sexual relationship. As we heard about HIV.
Because they're doing a bad act, so they deserve to be
suffered. So there's a belief that no, this is a subjective belief. They probably didn't even know they had syphilis. Some of them.
No, they deserved. They were we had 200 controls and 399 or 400 people who were suffering from syphilis.
But maybe they did, but they didn't know the seriousness of it or what the nature of the disease is. You know, they're sick. So I doubt that was an issue back then, that this is a payment for, that there's some
Punishment.
higher being or power in the shape of your God or religion or whatever that's telling you are being punished now because you're a bad person. I don't think that applied there. I don't think it applied. Already we had enough scientific evidence to believe, and I don't think anybody, it's a concern of the participants of what they believe, and I don't think that applied there. So in 1947, penicillin had become, so this is 15 years, the standard treatment for syphilis. It's there and it's available, and it worked very well. Choices might have included treating all the subjects and closing the study, or splitting off the control group and make it a proper trial, okay? But not go on with this, watching them and misleading them for the purpose of discovering the natural history. The study continued under numerous supervisors until 1972, when the press got hold of it. It got into the newspapers. Victims included numerous men who died of syphilis and wives who contracted the disease, and of course children. So there are big ethical issues, and cited as arguably, the Tuskegee study cited as arguably, debatably, the most infamous biomedical research study in U.S. history, led to the 1979 Belmont Report, an establishment of the OHRP, the Office of the Human Research Protections. It also led to federal regulation requiring IRBs for protection of human subjects in studies involving human subjects. Because IRBs and Research Ethics Board didn't exist before that. People simply did the best that they believed they could do. IRBs, they said there has to be some ethical oversight. You can't leave it up, because the government themselves were behind the Tuskegee government agencies, were the drivers behind it. So how can you leave it up to government? It has to be a separate institutional research ethics approval. So the study clinicians, there's a lot of detail here who they were. I'm not going to ask you name by name of what they did, but it's quite illustrative to see who they were. This fellow Talaferro Clark was credited with its origins. This is the United States Public Health Service. See, we don't have in Canada the concept of a public health service versus private health service. We have a publicly funded universal healthcare insurance. That's public, it's for everybody. There's no private one. If there's a private insurance, it's over and above. There is an allowance for private insurance for certain things that are not listed as covered. But all of the basic stuff is covered. So we don't have a public health system. You go back home to your own jurisdictions, and I know from my experience in South America, if you go to the public health side, they have nothing. There's nothing there. They run out of cotton wool, they run out of Band-Aids. I remember a chap I heard of in South America, he had cut his thumb on a farm equipment. So the friend took him to the public hospital. And so they said, okay, just hang on, we're going to inject this with lidocaine, local anesthetic. We inject it, and then we sew it up. And he said, wow, that hurt like crazy. It was so painful. I asked him, so, but they injected it first. Yeah, but it was very painful just the same. So then he came out, they asked the doctor, the emergency chap, so they injected him, he came, and they said, yeah, but we didn't have any, so we just inject with water. And so that's why it was painful, you see. So they run out of everything. I've seen back home all the foods, yes, you go. The people in the cafeteria in the hospital, and they go home, they practically what you can do, sugar. the people who attend and deliver the food to the patients. They take the food home to feed their children. Right? So public health is something, the public hospitals are nowhere near the private hospitals. So in order to get rid of that, we standardize everything here and we lift the bottom line. You lift the standard of care for everybody. So this is the US Public Health Service who did this. This fellow Clark, initial goal was to follow and treat syphilis in a group of black men for 6 to 9 months and follow up with a treatment phase. When he understood the intention of the other study members to use deceptive practices, deception is what? What is the definition of deception? It's when you give an explanation for a person to believe something that you yourself, you know it's false. That's deception. It's a form of lying. Lying is an expressed falsity. Deception can be that I ask you, so do you think that something is a certain way? And she explained to me, yes, I know she's wrong, but I don't say anything. That's, I allow for deception, but I didn't lie to her. So deception is widely used. So this fellow Clark, he didn't like this deception that they're going to lie to the participants, so he quit. And Clark had asked for the participation of the Tuskegee Institute and of a fellow, Doc Dibble, an African-American doctor. And then there was a third chap, Oliver Wenger, a Caucasian, director of the regional pH venereal disease clinic. And so these fellows pretty much took over. This is all the story here, but we don't, if you're interested in reading it, you can. This Von der Leer, on-site director of the research team and development policies, shaped the long-term follow-up section. He decided to gain the consent of the consent, quote unquote, by explaining to the patients that this was a form of treatment. This again is deceit, this is lying to the participant. You'll see on the last page here, I caught a letter. It's a little bit rough, but you can see it, and it said this was sent out. Some time ago you were given a thorough examination, and since that time we hope you have gotten a great deal of treatment for bad blood. This is what they told them syphilis is. You have some bad blood, your bad blood. You'll now be given your last chance to get a second examination. The examination is a very special one. After it is finished, you will give you a special treatment if it believes you are in a condition to to stand it. If you want this examination, you must meet the nurse, act, so on. She will bring you to the Tuskegee Experiment for the free treatment. You'll be very busy with these examinations. Treatments are being given. You will have lots of people to wait on you. You remember that you had to wait for some time when you had your last good examination. We wish to let you know that we expect it to be so busy, it may be necessary to remain in hospital over one night. If this is necessary, you will be furnished your meals and a bed and so on. So this is your last chance for a special free treatment. And this is when they would give them the spinal tap. The spinal tap is they take a sample of cerebrospinal fluid, but they want to see if the what is this? Is the bacteria that causes it? Trichomonas. So what kind of bug is that? A spirochete. It's like a little worm, right? If this can be found in the cerebrospinal fluid, the brain and spinal cord. Most of some of you chaps, we didn't do any in that physiology, but that's what it is. You stick a needle in. If some of you had babies and you had an epidural anesthesia, that's what they do. They put an anesthetic injection through space, they put an anesthetic in there, it anesthetizes the nerve roots below half the body, depending how high up this thing goes. You'll give them this. Yeah? So it's the same idea, except that you put the anesthetic into the cerebrospinal fluid, and you hope it doesn't raise too high. And then you can have a baby, and then try it all, you see, completely detached from this process. So CSF. So the
If you finish, I want to ask a question.
yes, so ask the question.
About Dr. Clark, here I realized early that this is not why he just quit.
Left.
What was his action?
Because doctors tend not to blow the whistle on their colleagues. They have the law of silence, the profession among the medical
His
profession.
honesty toward patients.
Yeah. Yeah. We have the medical colleges, the CPSO for instance, part of the role of the CPSO, the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario, which is the regulating college. It does have and it offers physicians to come if they have problems or if they perceive problems among their colleagues that could be damaging to the profession. They're encouraged to do that. But in this situation, I don't think this was set up so. But it certainly wasn't as sophisticated as it is now. So, study it again. This is Nurse Rivers, you see. Nurse Eunice Rivers. She was sort of the equivalent of a coordinator manager today. Borland Wanderler was a strong advocate for participation because she had a very good community relations. During the Great Depression of the 30s, the Tuskegee began offering lower-class African Americans who couldn't afford health care the chance to join Miss Rivers Lodge, and they were given free physical examination and free rides and hot meals and free treatment of minor ailments. So this all established a good relationship with them. And she grew to become a very, very important part. As Eunice Rivers, there's a picture of her here somewhere. There she is on the next page 3. John Heller later took over. By the late 90s, a fellow called John Heller, there's a picture of him here on the page on the right. Here's Fellow Clark, and these other players, our people. By late 40s, doctors, hospitals, and public health centers routinely treated diagnosed syphilis with penicillin. And then there came about the changes in the 40s, but we just heard the Nuremberg Code came out of the Nuremberg trials in 1947. So this is getting serious stuff. Now we have some ethical ideas, some ethical principles for the first time. And we have antibiotics. None of this is applied. Western allies formulated the Nuremberg Code to protect the rights of research subjects. But nobody paid any notice. I think it did come up, and when this issue of Tuskegee was discussed, and the investigators at that time, some of the medical doctors said, yes, well, we know about Tuskegee, but we know about Nuremberg, we know about the Nuremberg Code, we know that this trial went on and the people were punished. I said, but you have Nuremberg Code, how can you go on ignoring it? After 10 years, or 15 years after the Nuremberg Code, you still don't apply any of this here. And the argument was, yeah, but they need that because they were German and Europeans. They needed that punishment and those guidelines. We don't need this here. That was the argument that was given. So anyway, after that, you have Belmont. Brought to the National Center by a whistleblower who gave information to the Washington Times. Heller of the PH still defended the ethics of the study, saying that the men's status did not warrant ethical debate. This draws attention to the use of the word subjects. He says they were subjects. Remember that chap who I talked to you about when I was in London? He called a patient, said the specimen? Subjects. That's why we don't use this anymore. There were subjects, were not patients, clinical material, he said, not people. So you can read this, the study details. Initially, subjects back then were studied for 6 to 8 months, treated with contemporary method salvarsan, which is the earliest antibiotic. This came from the discovery of antibiotics by the dye workers in Germany, people who worked with dyes. The fabrics used to be dyed, given color, only with natural dyes, vegetable dyes that could be gotten from the ground. So they're all dark or black or green or brown or gray. But at about the 30s, they come up with the synthetic dyes. These are very potent dyes, and they allowed for the first time the blue and the reds to come out. And this was a whole new evolution in the dyeing of fabric. See? These were synthetic dyes made in the chemical factory. And some of these workers didn't get they get less infections than normal people, so they're exposed to some kind of antibiotic. From there comes the first antibiotic, salvarsan, called salvarsan. So mercurial ointments and bismuth, they were best mildly effective. Disadvantage, they were all highly toxic and balanced by the fact that no other treatment was known. Intended to benefit public health in this poor population. Tuskegee University affiliated hospital effectively loaned the PHS its medical facilities, and some more. So it recruited 399 syphilitic black men with 200 controlled, 201. The rest you can read is Oslo's stuff. You can skip the next 2 or 3 paragraphs and go to the middle of the page. It says, ethical considerations were limited from the start and rapidly downhill, deteriorated from there. To ensure that the men would show up for the possibly dangerous, painful diagnostic and non-therapeutic spinal tap. What does that mean, non-therapeutic?
No benefit.
Non-therapeutic, there's no benefit.
No benefit.
This is just a curiosity. This is not allowed. Non-therapeutic spinal tap. Doctors said following a misleading letter titled, last chance for special free treatment. That's at the back. I think it's this one. No, maybe it didn't. Maybe it's another one. The study also required all participants to undergo an autopsy after death in order to receive funeral benefits. So this is an inducement, you see. After penicillin as a cure, researchers continued to deny such treatment. Many patients were lied to and given placebo treatments, so that the researchers continued to observe the progression, the natural history of the disease. 1934, there were the first clinical data. That's all there is there. But in 1947, again, it had become the standard therapy. And the US government itself was sponsoring public health programs to treat it quickly, eradicate the disease. But when the campaign to eradicate the disease, this was a federal initiative, it came to Macon County, this is where Tuskegee is, they stopped it. They stopped this treatment with penicillin, prevented their patients from participating. In World War II, 250 of the subject men registered for the draft. They were consequently diagnosed and ordered to obtain treatment for syphilis before they could be taken into the armed services. So if they were going to volunteer, they had the draft. The draft is not voluntary. A draft means they have in some countries every male between the age of 18 and 45 you have to go and enlist, and you are a member of the armed forces. So these chaps show up there, they got diagnosed and they had to be treated. So they had their lives saved, some of them. VHS, what?
This 250 is a received treatment? I think the research prevents them from.
They would have got it
When they were army,
They prevented them from, they prevented them from getting treatment, deprived them of the chances for a cure. Having been diagnosed by an independent third party, on top of everything else, they are still prevented from getting the treatment. At the time, the PHS representative was saying, so far we are keeping the known positive patients from getting treatment. By the end of 72, only 74 of the test subjects were alive. 28 had died of syphilis, 100 were dead of related complications, 40 of their wives had been infected, 19 of the children born with congenital syphilis. So that's the story there. There's more here. You don't need to read the rest. You can read the ethical implications, which is the next section. The ethics. You have to look at this more closely. Researchers knew that syphilis is particularly prevalent in poor black communities. We didn't have the standards which we have now, for sure. And doctors routinely withheld information about patients' conditions from them. Doctors still have, they have a right to silence. And this is practiced if there's a genuine belief that disclosure of very bad news to a patient is going to cause a patient to quit or give up or lose hope. The doctors still are able to retain the information. In some cultures it's very extreme that they won't say anything to the patient. The physician is taught to believe that the patient has no knowledge of medicine, is unable to interpret medical information, and therefore is not given any information. We don't believe that here. After penicillin found to be effective, the study continued for another 25 years. This is not a month or two, 25 years, it's a whole generation still. After the study of constable became frontline, it was ended in a day. The aftershock of the study and the establishment of the National Commission for Protection of Human Subjects, Biomedical Behavior, and the National Research Act. So the effect of this, which I don't have, was that there was a huge distrust in the South of research above all. Still today, there still exists today a huge distrust of clinical research, all right, because of the tradition and the stories that have been passed down from generation to generation, including of clinical practice. Okay, so it had a very bad effect on research, this Tuskegee study.